Okay, recording started. Hello everyone and most welcome to Heidegger 1658. And we will today continue with the very last bit of third session of Derrida's Life-Death. Kalle, maybe you can share it with us. It has currently disappeared. Be so kind. So we managed to go through the whole third session of Life-Death by Jacques Derrida. And we are currently on page 75. We discussed earlier rigidness, flexibility, determinism, contingencies, and we mentioned Georgi Bujaki, which is a very important name, because for the ones of you who are interested, there is a video, an interview with Professor Peter Norstad at University of Chalmers about what is this Bayesian mathematics, statistics. It is actually both mother and father, as we mentioned earlier here. It has both traits at the same time. It is an opening up to a more encompassing understanding. Since I published the video, someone wrote to me that this makes it finally possible to have both sides, and the sides can still be completely different. It is very hard, I would say, to reach into that possibility without some sort of model that shows the possibility. George Buzaki, Bayesian mathematics, is a definite opener to that viewpoint. I continue the read. It's the second paragraph on page 75, beginning with third it is, sorry. It's the third paragraph just after the quote. Beginning with to all. To all, this would be easy. Too easy to respond that what we have here is a putting into perspective or into retrospective through a privileging of the now that can quickly seem naive. What is denounced today as metaphor was once operational, and what is today operational, if one follows this line of argumentation, is sure to be metaphorical tomorrow. And from where do we today get the assurance that the concepts of code are adequate? Adequate to what? To the progress of science. That notion is a little vague and homogeneous. And what if they also limited when interpreted in a certain way the progress of science? And what if these concepts were to be interpreted as a logos that resembles Aristotle's? And what if, conversely, one were to show that Claude Bernard's guiding idea, about which you will recall Jacob said that the modern biologist would not have to change a word, had also been operational. Yet there is yet a third movement in 3 times or 3 steps to show that the terrain upon which Claude Bernard had formed the concept of internal secretion, prevented him from conceiving of chemical messengers and unreadable word, which is what led to the informational code. Here it is not a metaphor that poses an obstacle to the concept, but a certain concept, a state of the concept that poses an obstacle to another concept, to another network or terrain. Claude Bernard anticipated without anticipating, between still and already. And the fact that we are speaking here of terrain and of network, not of one particular metaphor hindering the concept that it announces, but of what I will call one metaphorical conceptual system actively interpreting another. This fact should have required or will require a general reinterpretation with regard to life, death, because of life, death, because of a metaphor concept relation that will be understood neither in terms of a continuous teleology nor in terms of an epistemological break. Cangelan, as you saw, wanted to say both at the same time. which perhaps means, and that will be the lesson for today, and that they are more indissociable, listen to that, indissociable than one believes. And this is, of course, than one believes, and that is perhaps necessary as with life, death, to save them or lose them at the same time in a single stroke. This is, of course, impossible, at least before Christmas. We will continue directly with the fourth session, the logic of the supplement, and I make a summary together later on. The supplement of the other, of death, of meaning, of life. What is apparently most readable in the text of the modern biologist regarding his own science in the text that the modern biologist writes at once as scientist, as epistemologist of his science, as historian of his science, as philosopher of his science. What is apparently most readable in this text of the modern biologist or geneticist is that he does not write a text on something that would be outside the text. Hors texte. Something that would be atextual. That would form a referent whose nature would be to be foreign in its being, in its structure of a text. And there is no longer anything in the object of his science or his research, nothing as scientific object that is metatextual. My point in saying this is not to recall this mundane fact that the biologist or the geneticist has to refer, as he does indeed have to refer. For this is indispensable. To scientific writings, to an archive without which science would not be possible. But also more radically, that his ultimate referent, the living, along with the productive, reproductive structure of the living, is now analyzed as text. Its constitution is that of a text. And the emergence of scientific modernity in the genetico-biological domain consists, it seems, in this mutation by which science, by which knowledge is no longer the projection of a text on the subject of an object that in itself would be as the referent of this knowledge. Metatextual, but that is itself textual in its structure. What could have appeared more or less naively to be the limited condition of philology, of literary criticism, of the science of documents and archives, etc. Namely, having as its ultimate referent something that we used to call text, and that we believed we understood under this name. This condition is now shared by genetics, or the science of the living in general. And if the science of the living is not a science among others, but the science that is presupposed by all the sciences that determine their objects in their fields, involving the living, psychoanalysis, history, sociology, all the human sciences, but also the sciences inasmuch as they involve the activity of a living being. Thus, all sciences, all discourses, and all productions in general, how true, it involves everything. If then the science of the living is not a science among others, its textualization, the textualization of its object and of its subject, leaves nothing outside of it. It covers all areas. Unnecessary clarification by me. But this is incredible. This obviously does not lead to the claim, as one might be able to assert with a more or less interested or interesting naivitet, that everything is now going to be, as a result of this textualization, restricted to the safe confines of a book, of a notebook, or of a more or less specialized library. It leads, on the contrary, to an extremely violent reinterpretation of the limit between this inside and its outside. it brings in the question of inside, outside again. Before situating the problems that follows from this, let me clarify through a few references what I understand here by the textualization of the biological object or referent. As announced earlier, I will return for this to Jacob's The Logic of the Living. Quite apart from all the questions that might be raised by the manner in which Jacob determines this genetic textuality, it is incontestable that he constitutes the genetic as text, and that he is only describing and this is what gives one the right to treat him as representative or spokesperson for all modern genetics. A consensus and an approach that is today common in the field of genetics. We confirm this with regard to Jacob's notion of program and the word program. Here more broadly is what Jacob says about the general concept of the text, of which the program is a specification. Listen now. When heredity is described as a coded program in a sequence of chemical radicals, says Jacob, the contradiction between teleology and mechanism disappears. Later he writes, organs, cells, and molecules are thus united by a communication network. They constantly exchange signals and messages in the form of specific interactions between constituents. The flexibility of behavior depends on feedbacks, loops, the rigidity of structures on the execution of a program rigorously prescribed. Heredity becomes the transfer of a message repeated from one generation to the next. The programs of the structure to be produced are recorded in the nucleus of the egg. There is more than just messages, communication and transfer of information. One might in fact be tempted to say that such communication, such a language determined as communication, does not make it text. There is text only to the extent that there are instructional signs. An archive, codes, and deciphering. What Jacob calls the fourth structure of order to which modern genetics corresponds. The first order structure at the beginning of the 17th century corresponds to an arrangement of visible surfaces. The second order structure at the end of the 18th century to the organization that underlies organs and functions that was finally broken down into cells. The third order structure at the beginning of the 20th century corresponds to the discovery of chromosomes and genes. Finally, the fourth order structure in the middle of the 20th century, which is the discovery upon which modern genetics lives. Corresponds to the nucleic acid molecule. That these four structures shelter one another, inhabit one another, and are nested in one another like Russian dolls. To use the comparison that comes up frequently in this book, it being understood, as Jacob clearly notes, that the discovery of each new structure to which Jacob devotes each time a chapter of his book is not only an extension or a deepening of our knowledge, but a structural transformation of knowledge itself. A new way of considering objects. Moreover, for each order structure, one model, what Jacob calls a model. Will perhaps pose questions about this world later. Dominates as if in order to last, says Jacob, a biological theory had to be based on a concrete model. What was discovered with a fourth order structure and the model corresponding to this discovery is the text. The fact that reproduction, an essential structure of the living functions like a text, the text is the model. It is rather the model of models. Indeed, Jacob mobilizes several analogies to describe the object of this discovery, but all of them involve regulation by something like a recorded and deciphered program. Writing, reading, code, copies, etc. There is, for example, the analogy of the computer and the analogy of the factory. The analogy of the factory in the case of bacteria is eventually cast aside, and we will see why later. As for the analogy of the computer, it is dependent on the analogy of the text. This latter does not depend on the discovery of a substance, such as deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA. The existence of this acid had been known for nearly a century. It was known to exist in the nucleus of cells. Even its overall composition was known, but its role and its molecular structure remained unknown. It was the discovery of its role and its structure that led us to speak of the text. It was chemical and crystallographic analysis that allowed us to know this structure and this role. To know that we were dealing here with the long polymer formed by the alignment of 4 subunits. These are repeated by millions and permeated along the chain, like, says Jacob, the letters of the alphabet in a text. It is the order of these 4 subunits that directs the order of the 21 subunits in proteins. Everything then leads one to regard the sequence contained in genetic material as a series of instructions specifying molecular structures and hence the properties of the cell. To consider the plan of an organism as a message transmitted from generation to generation. To see the combinative system of the 4 chemical radicals as a system of numeration to the base of 4. In short, everything urges one to compare the logic of heredity to that of a computer. Rarely has a model suggested by a particular epoch proved more faithful. And I will now go to the outtakes of this text. Ooh. It's a bit of a culmination of the previous read. And if we have a look-see at page 75, which I wanted to bring into this as well. Give me a second. The names recurring, like Claude Bernard, Jacob, Gangelhan, have a similarity, and I'm so glad that that was stated by Jacques Derrida. At the very bottom, there is a nice one of 75. What is denounced today as metaphor was once operational, and what is today operational, if one follows this line of argumentation, is sure to appear metaphorical tomorrow. And I hold that goes for copy and original as well, because it has changed dramatically. On the next page, speaking of the third movement at the very end of the text. Again, and that it is perhaps necessary, as with life, death, to save them or lose them at the same time. in a single stroke. This is, of course, impossible at the very end, at least before Christmas. And he's being ironical here. Yes, I did actually underline what you marked there as well, Kalle. You can actually take that out. Will require a general reinterpretation regard to life-death because of life-death, because of metaphor-concept relation. That would be understood neither in terms of a continuous teleology, nor in terms of an epistemological break. And then, bearing that in mind, keeping that, we go on to the fourth session. Page 78. "20 lines down. I will not take the whole incredible Derrida sentence, it's too long. How many lines it covers. This condition is now shared by genetics or the science of the living in general. By all the sciences, I continue further down, that determine their objects in field involving the living, psychoanalysis, history, sociology, all the human sciences, but all the sciences inasmuch as they involve the activity of a living being. Thus, all sciences, all discourses, all productions in general, if then the science of the living is not a science among other, its textualization, the textualization of its object and of its subject, leaves nothing outside of it. Nothing. And I think that is the most important. Nothing is outside of the development within. To simplify evolution, but it's more than that. On page 79, third paragraph, fourth line, beginning with there. There is text. Only to the extent that there are instructional signs and archive codes and deciphering. Listen to that. It needs to be correct, everything. Now, that is what was discovered in the course of what Jacob calls the thought structure of order, to which modern genetics corresponds. And I will not go into the details But as you remember, it was made a comparison to the Russian doll, the very end here, and that comes all the way from the 17th century as sort of involvement, entanglement, interwovenness in this, I would call for short, original copy, cause and effect tendency. And remember, and this is the most important, nothing is outside of this. Actually, you can mark the whole text going down kind of that too, all the way to it being understood. A bit further down, there is text only to the extent, you go from there, all the way down to much further down. You can actually copy that. In some instances, send it to all the way to the Russian dolls to use to be a comparison. That comes up frequently in this book. It is locking everything. It's locking thinking. These are one of the reasons which, for instance, Hitchens said one couldn't be an honorable atheist, or I would say representationalist, before Darwin. And I'd say this development rules everything today, how we think about all sides of society. Nothing is outside of it. And we discussed earlier original text with Köhler, Klauck, Hoover, et al. And they are hugely influenced by this tendency, which is new. Once established, it runs its course, so to speak. It decides what is actual, what is real, or it decides the working manner. And as described in this little text by Derrida here, it's excellent. It's actually coming from Jacob, partly put together in a very nice manner. And one can here see how decisive, how locking this tendency once established, which took time, centuries, but it didn't take millennia. And I'd say it is presently in working order. And as we can see on next page 79, sorry, there's so many sites here. Jacob says, it starts actually at the end of 78, says Jacob, the contradiction between teleology and mechanism disappears. So thanks to this lockdown, it's a bit up on 79, the previous page kind of. On top of the text, up. And it starts at 78, between teleology and mechanism. And this is why it's so important. That contradiction haunted both Cangelan and Jacob, and they were under the impression that they've gotten rid of it. So you can have both teleology that is contingency, the mother, the flexible, and you can have the mechanism, the determinism, the father, the dead, at the same time. But they are not simultaneously present. He thinks the whole contradiction disappears, as he wrote. No. Derrida means it remains, but what is most important is how strongly this influences everything. And on top of the page 80, sorry for my confusion here. The text is the model, it is rather the model of model. Indeed, Jacob mobilizes several analogies to describe the object of this discovery, but all of them involve regulation by something like a recorded and deciphered program, writing, reading, codes, copies, etc. I would say the computer is here now, and we will later see the problem with factor, which is also used. I do still think that factor is not that bad, but it makes a whole change with this new lockdown. And this is why in modern text theory, within sociology, is all following this process model, if you like. This is how we see what is good. Derrida is revealing this in a very quite pertinent way. Wittgenstein calls this the myth of the private language. That there is a private language inside that rules everything, or there is an inner perception of everything. A ruler, like in Lord of the Rings, one ring to rule them all. Or the Chomskyan universal grammar, why not? It rules everything. I'd say universal grammar by Chomsky is identical to this, and so many other things. And we are unconsciously ruled by this. It's tough to point out, but Derrida did the trick here. Quite some outtake of one text alone. My colleague Kalle can't be heard here, which this is a bit pity. But I help him with. Theology and mechanism, yes, definitely. Teleology. Well, let me read what you wrote, Kalle. And Jacob dissolves it, takes it away, the problem. I would say Derrida's take is more that they are simultaneously present. But yeah, continue. Go on. Well, I would affirm the following. In the superposition, you have both, but once you observe, you have only one. Yes, exactly. That's the paradox that Jacob Kangelham think they got away with, and I think the rest of humanity as well. But in a way, they are simultaneously present, both of them. But at the same time, the collapse of the superposition, you have yet but one. Frank, please translate the following paragraph to English. Oh, he wants me to translate from Sweden. Swedish. I'll try. I do my best. A course I'm reading now he's reading a course in Gothenburg at Gothenburg University. To what extent, and now I am translating, to what extent does the book of Revelations, the authors of the book of Revelation, invite the receivers of what they wrote to sort of decode his images, to understand what these really, in citation mark, aims at, refer to. And to what extent he will sort of have an experience of a beyondness or celestial reality that doesn't need any form of decoding. And he adds, I see a dichotomy between interpretation and passive seeing. Yes, yes. To be compared with Giorgi Buzaki, and I think you managed to get the name right. It defies spelling. Congrats for that. Yes, it is that very interesting dichotomy. And who said that seeing is more active than passive? Yeah. Could one say possibly it's both, depending? And who said, well, from modern neurology, there's a uniform understanding that more nerve cells go to the eyes than from them. Would make seeing 3 times as active, but in a way it's both. But yes, yeah. Following the lead of Bujaki, all our sensory organs are active in the, if you put the human body in the classical model, so nicely put together by Derrida, here we can see how the lockdown works. Everything seems extremely active. Even the brain is in contrast to the Kangelham, Jacob idea, an eruption of creativity. Information creator, not a receiver of information. I think that makes the whole difference. I hope that sums it up pretty nice. Indeed, Jacob mobilizes several analogies to describe the object of this discovery, but all of them involve regulation by something like a recorded and deciphered program. Decode, decode. Aptly described by Derrida. Well, I imagine you think that sounds... So what should we do with the Russian doll? Well, we had another type of Russian doll as suggested by Diego Lucio Rapoport. A doll, yes, we should see them as entangled. He proposed that all the layers of the Russian doll are interconnected. And then we can have separatedness as well as unity. And of course, this is what Canguilhem, Jacob, and the rest of humanity today, after this lockdown, this fixation, cannot take. We are happy with either or. Either they are completely separated and we make a system out of this, or they are only one, sort of monism. But they are both not acceptable, but still the truth. I think maybe we should end there. What do you think, Kalle? Perfect. I say thank you very much. And thank you very much for participating, everyone who listened. And hereby I end 1658.